I learned a long time ago that the most expensive mistakes are usually made by people who never stop to ask one simple question: who actually owns what they are about to touch? The first sound that reached me that morning was not birdsong or the gentle rush of water beneath the old wooden bridge. It was the deep mechanical rumble of a diesel engine echoing through the narrow creek valley outside my property in western Montana. I stepped onto my front porch with a cup of black coffee still warming my hand, and the sharp smell of fresh hydraulic fluid drifted through the cool autumn air. An excavator sat beside the bridge my grandfather had built more than 50 years earlier. Bright orange safety fencing stretched across the entrance. Several construction workers stood waiting for instructions, and a white pickup truck bearing the Homeowners Association logo was parked near the road. At the center of it all stood the HOA president, Melissa Parker, dressed in a tailored navy blazer that looked strangely out of place beside heavy construction equipment. She held a clipboard with the kind of confidence that only comes from believing every decision has already been approved. The moment she noticed me walking toward the bridge, she smiled politely and raised one hand as though she expected me to thank her. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," she called across the gravel road. "We are finally replacing this outdated structure. The neighborhood deserves something modern and safer." I glanced at the bridge, then at the excavator operator waiting quietly inside the cab. Every weathered plank, every hand-cut beam, every iron bolt reflected decades of careful maintenance. I knew every inch of that bridge because I had inspected it twice every year since my father passed away. My name is Nathan Carter, and I have spent more than 20 years as a licensed civil engineer specializing in restoring historic bridges throughout Montana. I recognized good construction when I saw it, and I recognized an irreversible mistake even faster. "Who approved this project?" I asked as calmly as I could. Melissa tapped the clipboard against her hand. "The HOA board voted unanimously. We own the bridge now. It is community infrastructure." I nodded once without arguing. "Did anyone verify the property records before making that decision?" Her confident smile barely changed. "Our attorney reviewed everything we needed." Those words stayed with me as the excavator slowly rolled forward. The steel bucket lifted above the aging timber railing while neighbors gathered along the roadside, watching with curiosity instead of concern. Someone even pulled out a phone to record what they believed was a routine improvement project. I simply stood there and watched. I did not shout. I did not step in front of the equipment. I did not threaten anyone. Years of engineering had taught me that facts always outlast emotions. The bucket gently pushed against the first section of railing until aged wood separated with a deep cracking sound that echoed across the creek. The smell of fresh cedar rose into the crisp morning air as beams carefully removed from their joints settled onto waiting trailers. Within an hour, the bridge that had connected generations of my family to this land existed only as neatly stacked timbers waiting to be hauled away. Melissa walked toward me carrying a single envelope. "Since this improvement directly benefits your access road," she said with complete confidence, "the association has determined you are responsible for $186,000 of the construction cost." She handed me the invoice and waited for a reaction that never came. I looked down at the total, folded the paper once, slipped it into my jacket pocket, and thanked her for delivering it in person. The puzzled expression on her face lasted only a second before she turned back toward the construction crews. What she did not know was that the bridge they had just removed was never the most valuable thing standing on my property. The Real Foundation had been buried inside county records, forgotten survey maps, and one old metal box that had not been opened since my grandfather locked it decades earlier. I did not inherit the bridge because it was valuable. I inherited it because nobody else in my family ever considered walking away from the responsibility that came with it. My grandfather, Thomas Carter, first crossed that narrow creek in the spring of 1968 carrying little more than a toolbox, a rolled survey map, and an idea that most people thought was far too ambitious for a quiet stretch of Montana countryside. At that time, the road ended at the edge of the water, and during heavy rain the current became strong enough to isolate several neighboring properties for days at a time. Rather than waiting for someone else to solve the problem, he worked with the county, obtained every required approval, and spent months building a bridge that was designed to last far longer than anyone expected. He was never interested in creating something beautiful simply for appearance. He believed every structure should quietly earn the trust of the people who depended on it. My father inherited that same philosophy. Some of my earliest memories begin before sunrise with the smell of fresh coffee filling his old pickup truck as we drove toward the bridge carrying a worn leather toolbox that had belonged to my grandfather. While other children spent Saturday mornings watching cartoons, I learned how to inspect timber joints, measure natural movement caused by changing temperatures, tighten aging hardware, and replace weathered boards before they became safety concerns. My father repeated the same lesson every single visit. He always said that maintenance is invisible when it is done correctly, which is exactly why most people never appreciate it until it disappears. Those quiet mornings shaped the rest of my life. I eventually became a licensed civil engineer specializing in restoring historic bridges because I understood that every old structure carried a story far beyond wood, steel, or concrete. It represented generations of people solving problems with patience instead of shortcuts. Even after my father passed away, I continued following the same inspection schedule without missing a season. Every spring and every fall I completed a detailed report, photographed every major component, recorded moisture levels, inspected support members, and filed copies inside my workshop exactly as both of them had taught me. Neighbors often smiled when they saw me working alone beside the creek because they assumed I simply enjoyed old bridges. Very few realized I was preserving decades of engineering history one inspection at a time. Melissa Parker certainly never understood that. To her, the bridge appeared to be nothing more than aging timber standing in the way of a modernization project. She saw faded railings where I saw craftsmanship. She saw outdated construction where I saw proven engineering. She saw maintenance costs where I saw responsibility accepted across 3 generations of one family. Looking back now, I realized that misunderstanding became the foundation of everything that followed. The bridge was never important because it connected one side of the creek to the other. It mattered because every inspection report, every repair invoice, every survey note, every county correspondence, and every carefully preserved maintenance record represented promises that had never been broken. My grandfather understood something that I would not fully appreciate until many years later. Wood eventually ages. Steel eventually rusts. Even concrete eventually cracks. But properly documented truth has a remarkable habit of surviving every generation that chooses to protect it. Standing beside the empty creek after the demolition, I remembered one sentence my grandfather wrote inside the cover of his oldest inspection notebook. He had carefully printed the words in dark blue ink decades earlier. He wrote that a bridge is only as strong as the people willing to remember why it was built in the first place. At the time, I thought he was talking about engineering. I would soon discover he had been talking about something much larger. I wish I could tell you the demolition came without warning. But the truth is that Melissa Parker and the Homeowners Association had been trying to control that bridge for nearly a year before the excavator ever arrived. It started with friendly conversations during neighborhood meetings where someone would casually suggest that the bridge should become part of the association's maintenance program. At first, I simply smiled and explained that I had maintained it for decades without asking the neighborhood to spend a single dollar. Most people accepted the answer and moved on. Melissa never did. Every few weeks, another letter appeared in my mailbox requesting access for inspections, asking for maintenance records, or recommending that ownership be transferred to the association so future improvements could be coordinated under one unified plan. Each letter sounded polite, but every sentence carried the same underlying message. They believed the bridge belonged under their authority whether I agreed or not. I responded the same way every single time. I thanked them for reaching out, informed them that the bridge was privately maintained, and suggested they verify any remaining questions through the appropriate county offices before making assumptions. I never raised my voice. I never accused anyone of acting in bad faith. I simply encouraged them to confirm the facts before taking action. Looking back, I sometimes wonder how different everything might have been if someone had actually followed that advice. Instead, Melissa seemed increasingly convinced that hesitation only delayed progress. During one board meeting, she presented a professionally designed rendering of a decorative concrete bridge complete with stone railings, ornamental lighting, and landscape flower beds on both sides of the creek. Several residents applauded the presentation because it looked impressive projected onto the large meeting room screen. Then she turned toward me with a confident smile and asked whether I was finally ready to cooperate with the modernization project. I thanked her for the presentation and calmly explained that appearance alone could never justify replacing infrastructure that continued to perform exactly as designed. As a licensed civil engineer, I had inspected the bridge only months earlier and found no structural concerns requiring replacement. I also reminded everyone that before discussing construction, ownership and legal responsibility should always be verified. The room became unusually quiet for a few seconds before someone changed the subject. Melissa ended the meeting by saying the board would continue evaluating its options. That sentence stayed with me longer than I expected. Over the following months, I noticed unfamiliar contractors photographing the bridge from different angles, measuring nearby road widths, and placing temporary survey markers along the shoulder of the access road. Whenever I approached, they remained professional and explained they had been hired to evaluate possible improvements requested by the homeowners association. I never interfered with their work because taking photographs from a public roadway violated no rules. Instead, I quietly documented every visit myself. I recorded license plate numbers, photographed survey stakes, saved every letter, and kept copies of every electronic message exchanged with the association. Years of engineering had taught me that documentation often becomes the strongest witness when memories begin changing. Friends occasionally asked why I tolerated so much unnecessary pressure without confronting the board directly. My answer never changed. Emotions disappear the moment people start arguing, but written records remain exactly as they were created. My grandfather had preserved every inspection report because he believed future generations might someday need proof that careful work had actually been done. Without realizing it, I had inherited the same habit. By the time Melissa finally approved the demolition project, my workshop contained an organized timeline documenting nearly every conversation, request, photograph, and decision leading to that morning beside the creek. At the time, I considered it nothing more than professional record-keeping. I had absolutely no idea those ordinary files were about to become the beginning of something the homeowners association never saw coming. 3 days after the demolition, the noise finally disappeared, but the silence felt even heavier than the excavator ever had. Every morning, I walked to the edge of the creek with a fresh cup of coffee almost out of habit, only to find open water where generations of my family had once crossed. Temporary gravel ramps now sloped awkwardly toward both banks, while bright orange construction barriers blocked what had been a familiar path. For more than half a century, workers had already poured the first concrete footings for the replacement bridge before leaving the site to allow the material to cure. Melissa Parker considered the project practically finished. She even sent a community newsletter celebrating what she described as an important investment in the neighborhood's future. Several residents congratulated the board for improving property values. Others thanked them for replacing what they believed had become an aging liability. None of them had ever asked me why I had remained so quiet throughout the entire process. They assumed silence meant agreement. In reality, silence simply meant I was waiting until every decision had been fully documented. Later that afternoon, my longtime neighbor, David Reynolds, drove up my gravel driveway carrying 2 paper cups of coffee from the small diner outside town. We sat on the old wooden bench overlooking the creek without speaking for several minutes. Finally, he looked toward the empty crossing and quietly asked the question everyone else had been wondering. "Nathan, why did you let them do it?" I smiled without taking my eyes off the flowing water. Because sometimes the biggest mistake a person can make is believing they already know the truth. David frowned, clearly expecting a different answer. "You could have called the sheriff. You could have stopped the contractors." I shook my head slowly. Stopping equipment for one morning would never have solved the real problem. If they truly believed they had legal authority, they would have simply returned another day with another permit and another contractor. I needed every decision to happen exactly the way they believed it should. He stared at me for a long moment before quietly nodding. Although he still did not understand everything, he trusted me enough not to ask another question. After he left, I walked toward my workshop for the first time since the demolition. The building stood exactly as my father had left it years earlier. The scent of aged pine, machine oil, and weathered leather greeted me the moment I opened the heavy wooden door. Every tool remained in its familiar place. The old drafting table still held rolled bridge sketches. Shelves lined one wall from floor to ceiling, filled with neatly labeled binders documenting decades of inspections, maintenance reports, photographs, invoices, and engineering notes. I placed the Homeowners Association invoice on the workbench beside my grandfather's old leather toolbox and slowly removed my jacket. Something about seeing those two objects together immediately brought back a memory I had almost forgotten. Years before he died, my grandfather had once pointed toward a heavy, gray metal storage box hidden beneath the lowest shelf in the corner of the workshop. He told me that if anyone ever questioned why the bridge existed, I should never begin with opinions. I should begin with what was inside that box. At the time, I assumed he was referring to old construction drawings or sentimental family keepsakes. Standing alone inside the quiet workshop with afternoon sunlight filtering through dusty windows, I suddenly realized I had never actually opened it. I knelt beside the shelf, brushed away years of fine dust from the lid, and wrapped my hand around the cold metal handle. The small brass lock looked exactly as I remembered from childhood, untouched for decades. At that moment, I had no idea that everything Melissa Parker believed she had accomplished beside the creek was about to collide with a truth that had been patiently waiting inside that forgotten box for more than 50 years. The brass lock opened with surprising ease, almost as if it had been waiting for someone to remember it existed. A faint metallic click echoed through the workshop, followed by the dry scent of old paper that had remained sealed away for decades. Inside the gray storage box, there were no family photographs, no sentimental letters, and no forgotten keepsakes. Everything had been organized with the same careful precision my grandfather brought to every engineering project he ever touched. Thick survey maps were rolled together with cotton ribbons. Leather folders held county correspondence arranged by year. Original engineering calculations filled several bound notebooks, each page covered in neat handwriting and detailed sketches. Resting on top of everything else was a handwritten note addressed to whoever inherited responsibility for the bridge. I unfolded it carefully. My grandfather had written only one sentence. He said that if anyone ever questioned the bridge, they should never argue from memory when the county records could speak for themselves. I set the note aside and began reading through the documents one by one. The first survey had been completed before construction ever began in 1968. Every property corner, easement boundary, and access route had been professionally marked by a licensed surveyor whose seal remained perfectly visible despite the passing years. Beneath that survey sat the original county approval authorizing construction after seasonal flooding repeatedly cut off access for multiple landowners. As I continued turning pages, a much larger picture slowly came into focus. The bridge had never been built as a decorative feature for a future subdivision. It had been constructed under a recorded access easement recognized by the county decades before the Homeowners Association even existed. That single detail changed everything. I pulled out another oversized map and spread it across the drafting table. Red boundary lines traced every parcel surrounding the creek, while blue markings identified permanent access corridors that future property owners could not legally eliminate without formal county approval. The bridge sat directly within one of those protected corridors. My pulse remained steady because years of engineering had trained me to trust documents rather than assumptions, but I could not ignore what the evidence was showing me. Melissa Parker had not simply authorized the replacement of an old bridge. The association had altered infrastructure protected by recorded legal agreements that predated every governing document the Homeowners Association relied upon. The deeper I searched, the more remarkable the records became. There were inspection certifications signed by county engineers, maintenance agreements acknowledging my family's continuing responsibility, correspondence confirming that structural changes required, county review, and even photographs documenting the bridge immediately after its original completion. Every document supported the next one like carefully fitted pieces of the same puzzle. Then I discovered a sealed envelope tucked inside the final folder. Across the front, my grandfather had written, "Open only if the bridge is ever removed without our permission." Inside was a certified copy of the recorded easement, accompanied by a letter from the county attorney dated more than 40 years earlier. The letter explained that because the crossing served legally protected access rights, unauthorized removal could interfere with multiple recorded property interests and would require immediate review by county officials. I leaned back in my chair and slowly looked around the quiet workshop. The homeowners association had spent months believing they controlled the situation because they possessed confidence, committee votes, and architectural renderings. My grandfather had prepared for the same possibility decades earlier using something far more durable. Every signature was authentic. Every seal was official. Every page had been preserved with extraordinary care. I carefully returned each document to its folder, except for the certified copies that would soon need to leave the workshop for the first time in decades. Outside, the afternoon sunlight reflected across the creek where fresh concrete continued curing beneath temporary barriers. The replacement project looked orderly and efficient from a distance, but I now understood that beneath those new foundations lay a legal reality no construction crew could ever pour over. For the first time since the demolition, I allowed myself a quiet smile because I finally knew exactly where my next stop would be. Early the next morning, I loaded the certified copies, survey maps, inspection records, and my grandfather's handwritten note into a weathered leather briefcase that had traveled with 3 generations of my family. I drove 38 miles to the county administrative building, a brick structure that had barely changed since I first visited it with my father as a teenager. The familiar scent of polished wood and old paper greeted me as I walked through the front entrance. People hurried between offices carrying folders and rolled plans, each focused on their own responsibilities. I checked in at the engineering department and asked whether someone could review several historical infrastructure records connected to an access easement. Within 20 minutes, I found myself sitting across from County Engineer Rebecca Lawson, a woman whose reputation for careful technical review was respected throughout the region. She did not begin by offering opinions. She simply opened the first survey map, adjusted her reading glasses, and quietly started comparing dates, parcel numbers, and recorded seals. The room remained almost completely silent except for the soft sound of paper turning. After nearly half an hour, she looked up and asked a single question. Did the Homeowners Association submit any modification request through this office before the bridge was removed? I answered honestly, not that I have ever been notified. She nodded once and reached for her computer. Several minutes later, she turned the monitor slightly toward me. The permit database showed no approved application matching the location, no structural review, and no authorization to remove or replace infrastructure within the recorded access corridor. She continued examining the documents with even greater attention. Every maintenance report my family had preserved aligned perfectly with county records. Every survey matched the official plats stored in the archive. The certified easement copy carried the same recording information listed in the county index. Nothing conflicted. Rebecca finally leaned back and folded her hands on the desk. "Mr. Carter," she said calmly, "these records appear exceptionally complete. I believe this matter requires review by both the county surveyor and the county attorney before any additional construction continues." Those words carried no excitement, no accusation, and no anger. They carried something much more important. Procedure. I thanked her, left duplicate copies of every relevant document, and returned home without contacting Melissa Parker or anyone on the Homeowners Association board. There was nothing left for me to explain because the documents would now speak for themselves. Over the next several days, I noticed subtle changes around the neighborhood. White county vehicles began appearing near the construction site during normal business hours. Survey crews returned with professional equipment far more precise than the temporary markers I had seen months earlier. They measured property corners, verified elevations, and carefully documented every visible feature surrounding the creek. Nobody argued. Nobody raised their voice. The crews simply performed their work with quiet professionalism before leaving each afternoon. Residents naturally began asking questions. Some assumed the county was conducting a routine inspection. Others believed additional permits were needed before construction could continue. Melissa continued assuring everyone that the project remained under control, but I noticed something different whenever our paths briefly crossed. Her confident smile had become noticeably shorter, and for the first time since this entire situation began, she stopped making casual comments about modernization or property values. One evening, I received a certified letter requesting that I preserve all original records related to the bridge until the county completed its review. I placed the letter inside the same leather briefcase beside my grandfather's documents and quietly closed the latch. The legal process had finally begun moving on its own. I had not demanded it. I had not pressured anyone. I had simply handed the truth to the people responsible for verifying it. Watching the sunset reflect across the quiet creek that evening, I realized the strongest foundations are not always built from timber, steel, or concrete. Sometimes they are built from patience, careful records, and the simple decision to let facts arrive before conclusions. The first sign that everything had changed was not a dramatic confrontation or a public announcement. It was the sudden absence of construction noise. For nearly 2 weeks, the steady rhythm of concrete mixers, backup alarms, and diesel engines had become part of the morning air around the creek. Then, almost overnight, every machine disappeared. Temporary fencing remained in place, but the workers were gone. The half-finished structure stood untouched, and bright orange notices had been attached to several construction barriers. I did not walk over to read them because I already suspected what they said. Later that afternoon, my phone rang. It was David Reynolds. "Nathan," he said without even saying hello, "there are county vehicles everywhere. Survey crews, inspectors, and even someone from the attorney's office. Do you know what is happening?" I looked out the workshop window toward the quiet creek and answered honestly. "I know they are doing exactly what they are supposed to do." Word spread through the neighborhood faster than I expected. Residents who had proudly praised the replacement project only days earlier suddenly began asking careful questions during evening walks and at community mailboxes. Some wondered why construction had stopped. Others quietly asked whether permits had expired. A few even stopped by my property, expecting me to complain about the homeowners association. Instead, I simply told them the county was reviewing historical property records and that everyone should allow the process to finish before drawing conclusions. My answer usually surprised them because they expected anger. What they found instead was patience. Meanwhile, Melissa Parker became noticeably harder to find. She no longer stood confidently beside the construction site explaining future landscaping plans. Board members who once responded immediately to neighborhood emails now replied with short messages saying they could not comment while the review remained active. During one board meeting, several homeowners requested an update about the unfinished bridge. According to David, Melissa assured everyone that the delay was temporary and caused by routine administrative questions. Then someone asked whether the association had verified ownership before approving demolition. The room reportedly became completely silent. No one answered immediately. That silence spoke louder than any prepared statement ever could. A few days later, I received another certified letter from the county. This one requested original maintenance logs, engineering inspection reports, and photographs documenting the bridge before removal. I delivered everything personally the following morning. Rebecca Lawson greeted me with the same calm professionalism as before. She thanked me for preserving such complete records and explained that the county surveyor had confirmed every major boundary shown on my grandfather's original plats. More importantly, the recorded access easement remained legally active exactly as documented decades earlier. She could not discuss the full review, but her expression suggested the evidence had become increasingly difficult to dispute. As I left the courthouse, I noticed another familiar vehicle parked outside. Melissa's white pickup sat near the entrance with several folders visible through the windshield. She stepped out just as I reached the sidewalk. For a brief moment, we looked at each other without speaking. The confidence that had once filled every conversation was gone. She finally broke the silence. "Nathan, perhaps there has been some misunderstanding." I smiled politely because I had been waiting a long time to hear those words. "That is exactly why records exist," I replied. "They help everyone understand the same facts." I continued walking toward my truck without another sentence. There was nothing left to debate. The county possessed the documents. The surveyors had completed their measurements. The legal review was moving forward exactly as procedure required. Standing beside the creek that evening, I watched the unfinished concrete foundation catching the last light of the setting sun. Weeks earlier, it had looked like the beginning of someone else's victory. Now it looked like a reminder that even the strongest-looking construction cannot stand securely when it is built on assumptions instead of verified truth. The county scheduled the review meeting on a clear Tuesday morning, nearly 6 weeks after the demolition. It was held in a modest conference room inside the administrative building, far from the dramatic courtroom scenes people often imagine. There were no raised voices, no emotional speeches, and no surprise witnesses. There were simply engineers, surveyors, county officials, attorneys, and stacks of carefully organized documents spread across a long wooden table. Melissa Parker arrived with two members of the Homeowners Association board and the attorney who had advised them throughout the project. I carried only my grandfather's leather briefcase. Rebecca Lawson opened the meeting by explaining that the purpose was not to assign personal blame, but to establish the documented facts surrounding the removal of the bridge and the ongoing construction within the recorded access corridor. The county surveyor then presented enlarged copies of the original plats alongside newly completed field measurements. Every property line matched. Every recorded easement aligned exactly with the original documents preserved inside my workshop. There was no discrepancy to argue over. The county attorney carefully reviewed the timeline. The Homeowners Association had approved demolition without obtaining county authorization required for infrastructure located within the protected access easement. Construction had begun before the legal status of the crossing had been fully verified. Maintenance responsibility had remained with my family under agreements that had never been revoked. As each document was placed on the table, the picture became clearer until even those who had supported the project quietly stopped taking notes. Melissa listened without interrupting. The confidence that had once filled every conversation had been replaced by careful attention to every word being spoken. Eventually, the county attorney folded his hands and addressed the room. He explained that the review had found no evidence suggesting anyone intended to violate the law. However, good intentions could not replace recorded property rights or established legal procedures. Because the bridge had been removed without the required approvals, the Homeowners Association would be responsible for resolving the resulting legal and financial obligations, including restoration efforts consistent with county requirements. He also confirmed that the invoice previously issued to me carried no legal basis and should be withdrawn immediately. Melissa slowly opened a folder in front of her, removed a single sheet of paper, and quietly slid it across the table. It was a formal notice rescinding the $186,000 assessment that had been delivered to my property weeks earlier. She looked toward me before speaking. Mr. Carter, on behalf of the Homeowners Association, I acknowledge that we acted on incomplete information. We should have verified the historical records before approving the project. Her voice was steady, but noticeably different from the certainty I remembered beside the creek. I accepted the document with a simple nod. Thank you, I replied. Records exist to protect everyone, especially when assumptions become expensive. No one celebrated. No one applauded. There was only the quiet understanding that months of disagreement had finally ended because the facts had been allowed to speak without interruption. As the meeting concluded, Rebecca Lawson handed me copies of the county findings along with instructions outlining the next steps for restoring compliant access across the creek. Walking back to my truck beneath the cool Montana sky, I thought about my grandfather's old inspection notebook resting inside the briefcase beside me. For decades, he had preserved every survey, every maintenance report, every signature, and every photograph because he believed someone might someday need them. He had been right. The bridge itself had disappeared in a single morning, but the truth supporting it had survived untouched for more than half a century. That truth had quietly accomplished what anger never could, proving once again that the strongest foundations are not always the ones people can see. 1 year later, the first thing people noticed was not the bridge itself. It was how ordinary everything felt again. The morning air carried the familiar scent of pine and clean water drifting through the creek valley, while sunlight reflected across freshly finished timber railings that had been carefully designed to respect the original engineering rather than erase it. Following the county review, a new structure had been built in full compliance with every recorded easement, every engineering standard, and every legal requirement preserved in those decades-old files. Modern materials had been incorporated where appropriate, but the proportions, alignment, and purpose remained faithful to what my grandfather had envisioned back in 1968. Every time I crossed it, I could almost hear his quiet reminder that good engineering should never call attention to itself. It should simply do its job so reliably that people forget it is even there. The neighborhood had changed as well. The Homeowners Association adopted new procedures requiring independent verification of historical property records before approving any project involving shared infrastructure or adjacent private land. Future construction proposals now included county coordination from the beginning instead of treating it as an afterthought. New board members openly admitted they had learned an expensive lesson about the difference between confidence and certainty. Even Melissa Parker changed over time. Several months after the review, she stopped by my workshop carrying a small cardboard box. Inside were the original brass bridge plaques that contractors had carefully removed before demolition and stored without realizing their significance. She explained that they had recently been found in a warehouse and believed they belonged with my family. We spoke for only a few minutes, but the conversation felt very different from our first meeting beside the creek. There was no argument left between us because the truth had already settled everything that needed settling. Before leaving, she looked toward the rebuilt crossing and quietly said, "I understand now why you never shouted." I smiled and answered with the same lesson my father had taught me years ago. Structures are tested by pressure. So are people. She nodded once before driving away. Later that afternoon, I carried my grandfather's old leather toolbox across the bridge and stopped at the center, where the sound of flowing water blended with a gentle breeze moving through the cottonwood trees. I opened the toolbox, not because I needed to repair anything, but because I wanted to place one final item inside. It was the Homeowners Association invoice that had once demanded $186,000 from me. Across the front, I had written one simple word in black ink: resolved. I placed it beside my grandfather's handwritten note and quietly closed the lid. Those two pieces of paper represented opposite ways of seeing the world. One had been created from assumption. The other had been created from preparation. Only one had survived the test of time. As I walked back toward my house, I glanced once more at the bridge stretching confidently across the creek. People sometimes believe they can destroy a legacy by removing the thing they can see. What they often forget is that the visible structure is rarely the true foundation. The Real foundation had always been the survey maps, the maintenance records, the recorded easement, the careful documentation, and the values passed from one generation to the next. Wood can be replaced. Concrete can be poured again. Even an entire bridge can disappear and be rebuilt. But truth that has been patiently preserved remains, standing long after every false assumption has quietly washed downstream with the current.